Nuhuam Hanalas, Gaisnalach Kokwakiwach, coming here from Yalise, Alert Bay, and Kokwakiwach territories. Again with Julius, who'll be guiding us through another drawing today, and Helen Davis, who I believe I'll let her introduce herself and her backgrounds.
Thanks. I'm Helen Davis. I'm a bear biologist. I have been working on bears and bear denning for 30 plus years. So I can hopefully answer any questions anyone has today. Looking forward to this.
And I've done this a few times now, so I think everybody's probably pretty familiar with me from the previous ones. I'm just really pleased to again be joining and to be able to participate this way and have this another wonderful way to outreach to people, and hopefully we can have some fun learning about black bears today denning. Unless I guess you had a few words before we wanted to get started, right?
Yeah. I mean, as usual, it's going to be very fun being able to engage in these drawings, and all these conversations are very fun. With Julius, but again, talking about, I guess, the importance of preservation when it comes to making sure that these animals have homes and good sources for food, and that we're not disrupting their territories when we get caught up in different our human activities of expansion, and understanding that we're in their homes. Like every town was a bear home at one point. So that's just one thing to be aware of going forward. There are talk about them being our neighbors, our brothers, our cousins, and that's very true when it comes to the bears. They're a crest for a lot of people. I myself, from the Mamtagila tribe of the Kokwakiwach Nation, we have the grizzly bear is our crest. Or it's my crest anyways from them. So very sacred when we go into these territories to announce ourselves to the bear. So again, yeah. Hey,
Nice. And I guess did we want to do the shout outs now, or for the classrooms that had requested that? I think that was usually what we end up doing there is.
I think Maya said there was some more today, but I only have a list of one from James Bay Community School. I'm assuming that's from Victoria, BC, grade 2-3 class, Miss Fellman's class. And then Liz Cram's grade 4-5 class from Kitchener Elementary in Burnaby. And Mary Levioltz, probably butchering that, grade 2-3 class at the Ecole Deo and Comox. I'm butchering that. I know that my French is not that good.
Hey everyone.
Hi.
Excellent. Okay. Oh, excellent. I see Shar joined us as well, maybe. Excellent. So shall we get started? Is there anything else you'd like to say before we jump into the drawing part of it?
Nothing from me. Anyways.
Okay. Well, in that case, why don't we start? What I'll do is actually, did you guys have any videos you wanted to share first, or we can go back and forth between them? That would be the other thing, because we can just start with the drawing otherwise, and then as it becomes pertinent, we can just kind of switch over to the video, and that can work as well.
Oh, it looks like someone here is asking for a little bit more of your background here, Julius.
Oh, for me,
Yeah.
well, my background is I am trained as an ecologist and a microbiologist in that order. And so I've worked with different kinds of animals and plants and fungi and tiny organisms, microorganisms from various weird and wonderful parts of Canada and North America. Before getting into scientific illustration, which I started during my PhD on microbiology, and that was fun and very interesting adventure. But now I mostly, well, pretty much I'm full-time scientific illustrator, but I get the fun time to work with scientists to describe new species, to make illustrations for new papers and for museum exhibits and books for kids and so on. And I love that a lot, because to me, the most important thing in the world is to endeavor to protect our biosphere. And if I can do that using artwork as well as science, then I'm all the happier. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit of where I come from that way.
That's a fun background there. Yeah. And I guess I should also state I'm here as a cultural voice, and I have done some forestry work as well. Mostly in identifying culturally modified trees, so trees that have been cedar bark stripped, but also some have looked out for some bear dens. And in one case, I found a bear den in my Kwakwaka'wakw territories, and it was also happened to be a cedar. It had been a planked tree, so what that means is, like in my culture, the way we would build our big houses or our structures to live in, we would take a single plank from a tree and leave it standing. And so, say like 80, 100 years ago, someone had taken a plank from this tree, and that tree was also being used as a bear den when I come across it. I kick myself right now because I was looking for a picture of it in my phone, but I couldn't find it. So I wanted to share that with you guys, but alas, I couldn't find it in my phone today.
Is that the one just south of the Port Hardy Airport?
You know, I believe so. Yeah, it was around there.
It's somehow not surprising that Helen, the bear biologist who is really familiar with the bear dens, would probably know where a lot of these ones are as well. Then that is really amazing.
The majority of my work has been done in the area that Hanalas lives. So
nice. It was really cool. Okay, so yeah. So why don't I start sharing the screen? We can get some visuals on the bears here. So I'm gonna start up. Here's what this is basically a preview of kind of what we're going to be drawing today. Now, this is a lot more detailed than we'll have time to put into it today, but it gives you kind of a guide so that you can put in some of the fur and shading afterwards. We're going to mostly go with the shapes of the animals, because I always find it really hard to get the proportions right, for them to have the right shape initially, especially with faces of bears and dogs and those kinds of mammals. I find that really challenging. So we're going to try to make this easy so that we can all kind of draw these amazing animals, which are often referred to as charismatic megafauna as well. They actually cause a bigger emotional response in people than many other organisms that I tended to make a lot of friends with, like the bacteria. So, you know, sad for the bacteria, but nice for the bears, because they're able to get a lot of attention, and we want that for their habitats, right? And so they're actually really effective ambassadors for their ecosystems in that sense, in reaching out to the public. So here's kind of what we got. And I'm going to do this in a digital format. So I have a drawing tablet, but you can do it on paper as well. And I've selected my canvas to be about 8.5 by 11 inches in size, sort of your typical letter size paper. So you can use that as well. And just want you to pay attention to two things. One, where we're going to be putting the lines on the page. And I'm going to try to make that as clear as possible. And also, sometimes I'll say to, make sure this next bit of lines you're going to make are very light or at a different color, because we don't want them to show up so much in the end. They're going to be mostly guide lines. And then afterwards, we'll put in the darker lines, but I'll let you know when that happens. And the way I'll let you know from my end is I'm going to put those lines in red. And so you can see the difference and you'll know which lines to make lightly. Okay. So with that, why don't we launch into the drawing itself, and we're going to talk about the amazing lives of these bears and how important old growth ancient forest is to them. So we're going to make the preview disappear there for now. And for here, what we want to do is start with kind of bits of the mother bear. And actually, so just to put this into perspective, as I draw this, we want to kind of imagine the context, the environment in which we are here. So as I'm going to start to put these lines in place, I'm going to make a circle, or sort of close to a circle, a little bit of an oval, and then there's going to be a bit of a slanted cross in it to identify where the eyes and the nose are going to be. But while we're doing that, Helen, why don't you describe to us what's significant about these bears and their dens in these old growth forests and what we're looking for in this environment?
Okay, great, thanks. So bears in coastal British Columbia, but also coastal Alaska, Washington, and Oregon, usually use hollow trees for their winter den sites. And those dens can often be in hollow cedar trees. They can have entrances that are in the base called basal dens, or they can have entrances up the side of the tree. So a bear might climb more than 10 meters up the side of a tree and go into a cavity that is up higher up in the tree. These are great den sites for females who are having cubs, and the winter dens that bears use are actually the only place that they can have cubs. Their cubs are born in January or so. They weigh only about a pound, and they need to nurse on their mothers for 70 to 100 days and grow during that time so that they're big and strong enough to be able to climb trees for safety when they leave the den. And they're born basically hairless and eyes closed and not able to be out wandering around. So safe den sites are absolutely critical to having bear populations persist in our province, for sure.
I think it's interesting and important to remember that bears, although a lot of us think of them as like top predators, they face dangers themselves, especially when they're young. And in the past, before a lot of the recent extinctions of a lot of the really bigger animals that lived in association with them, there were larger animals that actually potentially fed on black bears as well, like saber-toothed cats, Smilodon, and so on. And so they actually evolved with an interesting community that's no longer there. So it's not surprising that they need to seek out these areas that are well protected and that they can squeeze into for safety with their cubs.
Yeah, that's true. And they have predators now too, whether it's wolves or cougars can prey on denned bears, but also, unfortunately, there's a bit of cannibalism that sometimes happens with bears, especially because the males den quite a bit shorter time period than the females who are having cubs. So some of the males may den on Vancouver Island, especially as short as 3 months, usually a bit longer, but the females who are having cubs can be in there for 6 months. So it's a bit of a risky situation for them. But also on the mainland, you can have grizzly bears that can potentially prey on black bears as well too. So there's a few things that might go after them in the winter.
And it's these are really big trees that are going to be the most important for them, right? Because I mean, and a lot of people sometimes, you get the impression that, oh, well, it's okay to cut down all the old growth forest because it's just going to, rejuvenate the forest and all that. But what's really important is these giant ancient trees that are still standing, right, for the dens, for these kinds of dens that you're talking about, where they can climb up a distance safely out of the way of predators and make their home inside of something that's big enough to hold these large animals.
Yeah, and the average diameter of their hollow trees that are used as dens is usually over 140 centimeters.
Wow.
They can get up to 300 centimeters. And I think Maya has a link to a little video all about dens that occur in hollow trees and what they look like, that she is going to post in the chat, I think. Okay. So you can watch those later and see what some of the dens look like. But those large old growth trees that are being cut down that are dens don't get replaced in the next rotation of forestry. We don't let trees grow anywhere near big enough before they're reharvested. So we're only losing dens. We're not growing any new dens unless there's actual planning for recruitment of new dens, it's called. And that's super important, is the trees that are second growth trees are being cut down when they're only about at most a foot diameter.
Wow.
It's nowhere big enough to house a bear den.
Barely even a newborn.
Barely.
No. Yeah, I do that a lot. Unfortunately, most of my puns aren't intended. Sorry. Oh, thanks for catching up. Good one. So in the meantime, I'm as you see, I've zoomed in, so it makes it easier for us to see. These are the two. They don't look much like bears yet, granted. But trust me, we're going along the way. We've started to put in, you see the way that I've put the dotted lines in the red there. These are kind of just little guides for us for where we're going to put important parts on the face of the animals. And the top one is the mother's head and the bottom one is the young one's head. And these are the eyes that I've started to put in on the mother. And they go just about right through that central slanted line. And think of them as like lemon shapes almost. They're not quite lemon shaped, but that's close. And then, of course, there's also a little bit of the eyelid that you see visible. These black bears have slightly lighter rims around the eyes. Actually, I found it interesting that there are, I think, about like 4 different subspecies of black bear that live on various parts of our coastal area in BC, including the Olympic black bear. There was the Haida Gwaii populations, the Vancouver Island ones from the north of Vancouver Island, and also the Kermode or spirit bears, of which most of them are still black, I guess, but that's where you see some of those wonderful light colors like blonde or even white colored coat, which is just so fascinating, I think. And from what I understand, it may help them to camouflage them essentially against the sky when they're hunting for salmon to some extent, and that salmon can't see the black color of the bear so easily sneaking up on them. But it's just amazing to see this. Putting the eyes in the little one as well in the meantime here. Oh, and if I say anything that is not actually accurate, Helen, please feel free to correct me, because I'm all about accuracy as much as possible, but I'm by no means an expert in all of these fields. And so I love to learn. And this is what this is all about. And I really don't want to be spreading anything that is incorrect.
Oh, that was all true about the Kermodes. They did some really cool work with poor grad students in white outfits and stuff, seeing how the bears reacted differently to, and I think they had a barrel suspended or something, comparing how the fish reacted to black versus white, and felt that maybe the fishing success of the white color was greater in the day than it is of the black colored bear. So maybe it's sort of an advantage of being white that they can catch fish easier. So yeah, that was some cool work done on the mid coast. I think on Gribble Island, north of Princess Royal Island. I think that was done. Yeah.
Sounds like a fun project. I wonder how much of this has arisen recently, and whether or not we're seeing any any remnants of ice age or glaciation impacts on population, because of course we had several species that are adapted to more Arctic regions, which tend to have more white coats. And it often made me wonder whether or not the Kermode bears might have been a genetic remnant of populations that were more common perhaps during times when glaciers were more prominent in North America. But we can at least see a function for these coats potentially today that is aside from, that is different from hiding against the background in on land.
Yeah, because they are so, they stand out so much on land that, yeah, you wouldn't think that it would be an advantage. But considering where they are on the mid coast, they probably aren't remnants from glaciation, since they are between the two areas that weren't glaciated between Haida Gwaii and Brooks Peninsula. So
makes sense. That might be a good way to distinguish as well, scientifically. That's pretty fun. What we're going to do is I'm going to fill in the eyes a bit, because the eyes of black bears are really dark. And so what we want is to make them look right. And so we're going to mostly fill them in with black, but keep in mind, these are shiny, right? So if you look at any shiny object with light on it, you'll have that little bit of a glare, that glint in a part where it's reflecting, for example, the sun. So we're going to leave a little white spot near the top of the eyes and fill in the rest with black. So I'm going to start with the mother's eyes like this. And so you see I'm drawing a little circle, and then the rest of it on the inside of the eye can be filled in, because they have dark pupils, but they also have dark irises. Irises are the part that are colorful in our eyes. That's that muscle that opens and closes down the pupil, so it lets light in either more or less, so that we can actually get light onto the back of our eyes, the retina, where it's transmitted to nerves, basically. And now with the baby here, with the little cub, and oops, here it is. Fortunately, I have an undo or back step, which we don't have in other forms of media. There we go. So these are shiny eyes. Here we go. So we got two bear eyes and very, very unbear-like faces so far. But we're getting there. Okay. And of course, I was interested to find out that bears have an incredibly a powerful sense of smell, or sensitive. Much, much more so than even dogs. I mean, obviously much more than us. Even dogs do a much better job of sensing their environment through smell. But bears, apparently, black bears are even more sensitive to smells than are we, which is great in an environment where they need to rely on everything from berries to fresh shoots to carrion, or basically animals that have died, and they need to seek those out a lot of the time to eat them, because it's an easier meal than having to hunt something down, right? It's free. And most people don't realize, or a lot of people maybe don't realize that carnivores, even animals that eat meat, they would prefer in most cases to get the easy meals, and it's harder and more risky to them to be injured if they were to hunt animals. And in many cases, if they can eat free meals from animals that have died, it just makes a lot of sense, because it's always an investment. They have to pay a risk of getting injured in trying to take down a living animal. So in some animals, like black bears, they will certainly go for dead animals if they have the chance. I'm going to put in the nose of the mother here, along the middle.
That's true, Julius. There's salmon berries, for example, don't put up much of a fight. Right. Other than maybe some thorns or something, it's not too risky for the bears. So yeah, they like to concentrate on sort of greenery in the spring when they first come out of their dens, eating horsetails and grasses and sedges, especially sedges on the estuaries of the coast. And then as the berries start ripening, they switch to the berries, especially the salmon berries to start with. And then when the huckleberries start getting ripe, and then into salal berries, and then of course, moving on to salmon when there's spawning salmon available to them, is how they put on that last weight gain that's so very important for them to be able to survive the winter in this den that you're drawing. When they're in this den, they aren't eating, drinking, pooping, or peeing for months and months, that they're living off just their fat reserves. And they're physiological marvels because they can do that. And they're also not losing muscle mass and bone density, which is human being in a bed for 3 days, we start to waste away very quickly, whereas these guys are able to recycle everything within their body to keep their muscle mass and keep the moisture out of the fat that they're burning, and live off of that without needing to leave the den.
That's
Yeah,
actually really fascinating. Sorry, go on. Yep.
totally. Yeah. We're talking about the importance of old growth for bear dens, but also thinking about the certain berry bushes and stuff like that that get destroyed when certain companies are clearing out whole watersheds. I've seen whole blueberry patches just decimated, and like so like I said, I've done some work in forestry and looking for CMTs, culture modified trees. Well, we went to this watershed. I want to say the Tessium watershed, and this is in Montequila territories. And it was pretty much all of it was pretty much cleared out except for one block what was left. And we went into the block and went down to the bottom. We saw all these blueberry bushes, and you could see the evidence of bears making their own trails in between them and stuff like that. And then come back a year later and then that block's gone. So that's another food source for those bears in that area that's gone. And it's like that's part of saying that there are neighbors. We need to watch out for their food sources as well. It's not just us who need berries or salmon. It's also the bears, right?
Remember to share. I mean, absolutely. And bears have enormous home range. It means the area that they travel through to, that holds their food. It's like their great big refrigerator or pantry, right? So they need to travel through many square kilometers. And if we destroy certain important foods, that means they may have to travel further to get some of the food, which of course then increases the chance of interacting with them in communities that encroach on their habitats. And of course, it just reduces their chance of survival if there's a lot of limitation in their foods. And as Helen was saying, with this amazing amount of their ability to survive in their dens for months without eating, they need to be able to pack on the pounds before that so that they have this. So if we remove their food sources, we're endangering them over that long period of time that they need to be in the dens. And because they're also feeding their cubs, they get born there, and then they have to drink milk, and the milk takes out some of the nutrients and resources from the mom as well.
Yeah, and bears are what we call delayed implanters. So they actually breed in the late spring and early summer, and the egg and the sperm meet and develop to an 8-cell stage called the blastocyst that doesn't develop any further. It just kind of floats around in the mom for months until she goes into her den. And if she's actually not fat enough when she enters the den, she'll just reabsorb those blastocysts.
Okay.
She won't produce cubs. So she does actually have to reach a minimum weight in order to be able to produce cubs. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to survive the denning season and nurse them if she didn't have enough fat stores. So
that's amazing.
Small weight gain is super important for cub production.
So if they don't have the weight gain, then we're sacrificing a generation of cubs in that year, basically, potentially, if we interfere enough with their resources, if we take away too much, potentially.
It's happening in years where we have a lot of problems with the climate, with climate change. If it's hot too early and so the berries don't develop, that kind of thing, it can really impact them. Or our declining salmon stocks on the coast are having a big impact in some areas as well.
That's actually a good point. Salmon don't put up as much of a fight to them either, as much as large animals would, but they're crucially important to the bears at some times of the year, and they are a big source of protein. Most of their protein has to come from meat because there are very few plants that have a lot of protein in them, and nothing as much as meat does. So fish are a very important part for their food. And unfortunately, the fish we're seeing these days are being impacted not just by the diseases caused by the introductions of high densities of fish in salmon farms, for example, that spread to wild populations in large numbers, but also because, as you're saying, with climate change rapidly modifying the temperature of their environments, it can actually kill off many spawning salmon and young salmon at crucial times of the year when they need to negotiate those rivers. And those salmon, the really neat thing about them is not just that they feed the bears, but because the bears feed on the salmon and transport, digest them and then poop them out elsewhere, the nitrogen from those salmon from the ocean is transported to the forests, and that's crucially important in these ancient rainforests of the temperate west coast of BC, which are very much dependent on the nitrogen, a very important element for plant growth that comes from the ocean in large part. So the bears are actually benefiting the forest by moving nutrients from the ocean through the fish into the forest to feed the giant trees in which they then make their dens.
Yeah.
So complicated and wonderful, and super important to preserve.
Salmon that they are carrying on average 150 meters away from the rivers are, there's all sorts of small animals that are also feeding on the salmon that they've taken out of the creeks. There's all the insects that are feeding on it. And then, like you say, the nitrogen that goes into the plants, and up to 70% of the nitrogen within the vegetation and trees around a salmon bearing stream can be ocean derived nitrogen.
Amazing.
That it comes from the fish that have died around those creeks. It's amazing.
Super important. And this is the thing that we need to remember, that it's an interconnected community and an ecosystem that we need to preserve, not just individual species. We can't think of them alone. We have to think of them in the community that they are. They function in a very, very complex way. And if we interfere with parts of it, we can destabilize the whole thing in certain ways. So we have to be very careful with how we tread. In the meantime, I've been adding some of the parts of the muzzle around both the mom and the cub. And you can see that now we're starting to get, where the mouth is, and then there's the bit of that snout, because bears, unlike cats, but like dogs, they have this long muzzle. They have these big noses with large nostrils. And of course, that's really effective for them to be able to get enough air for smelling.
It's that creates the surface area so that they can smell so well. There's actually a few questions, Julius, for you as the artist. And I got to say, it's fascinating that you have the science background and you're an illustrator, because I'm sure you know that most of us scientists do not have an artistic bone in our bodies. And so this fascinates me that you can be both, because I have no ability to draw. I draw stick men very well. So there is a question about, I love the aspect of illustration. I'm wondering if you can talk about why art and illustrations has a place in the world where we have photography.
Ooh, that's a good one, actually. That's a good question. My background so the easy question, the easiest way for me to answer that, or the most obvious way, is that my background in scientific illustration is mostly actually deals with prehistoric animals, such as dinosaurs and prehistoric mammals and so on. So I attend conferences with scientists who are paleontologists a lot. That's what most of my work is around. And of course, with those, we don't have photographs of living versions of them. So there's this interesting interconnected, sort of mutually beneficial interaction between what we call paleo artists, those of us who draw and paint extinct animals, and paleontologists who study these animals and plants and fungi and everything else. And that each of us relies on the other. We rely on the paleontologists for the information to make these reconstructions, but the paleontologists benefit from having these reconstructions of living versions of the environments that they study in bones and other preserved parts. And that actually helps them to spread their message to the public, because pictures are really popular in news media and help to make their research much more visible. But this is also true for not just paleontology. So for example, here we are on a free webinar meant to spread the message to many, many people about how important it is for us to preserve these environments that certain animal species require for their survival. And we're doing that in a way that is fun. We're not just speaking it, which is great in itself, but we're making it an interactive activity. So this is one other way we can use artwork as an effective tool in conservation biology. Also, I've worked with scientists that have been writing up descriptions of new species for which we don't have a lot of good photographs because they're hard to get to. They live in very unusual places that are hard to get to. So it's easier for us to be able to draw pictures and highlight those parts of them that they want to highlight in their study than to actually be able to go there and photograph some of them. So we have the animals to work with, some photographs, but we want to show them in their environment. And that is really hard to do sometimes. So that's kind of part of where I come from that way.
During my career as well, I mean, the study that I worked on the North Island at the beginning of my career, we had the very first versions of wildlife cameras that had a snowmobile battery in them to power it, and a print film camera. If the teachers are going to have to describe to kids what that is.
That's right.
24 or 36 images on a roll of film. But nowadays with these amazing and not very expensive wildlife cameras, we can learn so much more about the animals. So if you look at that video that Maya posted in the chat of what tree dens look like, she's also got another one she can post of what dens and coarse woody debris look like. And there's some great footage in one of those of a female and a yearling cub gathering bedding to put in the den. So these bears are spending their winters inside the trees, but they often like to drag in a whole bunch of vegetation, plants and tree boughs and stuff to line the den with to make it insulate it from the ground, because they lose most of their heat through touching the ground. Their hair and their fat insulates their top layer that's exposed to the air, but insulating them from the ground can be done with vegetation. So there's some footage in those videos of a mom and cub. They tend to break off ferns and tree boughs with their mouth, drop them on the ground, and then they back up towards the den, pawing it underneath themselves, and back up and paw it underneath themselves as they back up towards the den, and then line it with the vegetation. And they can create incredibly thick, almost looks like a big bird nest inside some of these trees. I make a real cup bed that they can curl up and almost be level with the top, and that helps insulate them while they are living off that fat and not eating and drinking all winter.
Pretty amazing. I'm sorry, go on.
So the footage from these fancy new cameras that we now have has allowed us to see that. And when I started my career, I would have given anything to watch a bear gathering the bedding. I wanted to see, what did this look like? I've had a female who used a den inside a stump for 4 years in a row, and I got a lot of footage of her gathering bedding and stuff. But I was so excited the first time I saw it. I just I was in tears. It was just so exciting to get to see this. But she tends to do it in kind of slow motion, like she's a little out of it, and so she'll kind of stand and stare off in the distance, and then pause some more and stare. I was like, oh my God, if I have to watch one more video now. I used to think it was amazing, and now I'm like, can't you do it a little bit quicker?
That's funny.
Tell us what you're doing here, Julius.
What's that? Sorry?
Tell us what you're drawing on here.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think it's just fascinating first that to think that many other animals than birds make nests like this, but bears do, dogs do. Our dog actually just makes nests very much like what you're describing about the pawing under themselves. One of our dogs does that a lot, so she must think she's a bear. But I'm working on here the ears now of the mom and the cub. You can see they're very rounded. But one thing we have to keep in mind is that bears have a lot of fluff. They have a lot of fur. And I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of a bear. Unfortunately, some animals will develop what's called mange, and they can lose their fur. It's a disease. But when they do, you can see actually the structure of the tissues under the fur. And it's amazing how different bears' ears look without the fur. Fortunately, mange can be cured. So that's not necessarily permanent, but when you see that, it's a huge difference in their appearance. They have a lot of fur. So I'm drawing in some of these furs inside the ear that help to line the inside and keep dust and other insects and stuff from easily flying right into the ear as well. Happens in us as well as we age sometimes, but when we're younger, normally we don't have a lot of fur in our ears. But these guys do. And so here we have both. Now you're starting to see that heads are starting to look a lot more like our bears. Heads should. And actually, I'm going to put in black now the outline we want to have on the mother. And when you're doing this, give it a little bit of a jaggedy look, because again, this is fluffy. They're very fuzzy. They kind of have a smoothish outline. They do, but it's okay to give it a little bit of a rougher look, because you're communicating the fact that these are quite fuzzy. And in some of them, and in the young, for example, you can see that there's those separate hairs pretty well. They kind of look very fluffy when they're young bears, for example, as well. And you also have these lines, these little slight indentations that on their head that just show where there's like almost a mane developing on the side of their face. So their skulls are actually much smaller than the outline of their head, because it's so much fur. This is wonderful for animals that live in the north. And although we on the West Coast here don't have exceptionally cold winters, bears in general live in some really cold places. Think of polar bears, for example, which actually have to survive diving in Arctic waters for their food. So there's very complex types of fur that they grow. There's an underlayer that's very dense, and there's a layer of guard hairs that are thicker and less numerous, but they help to insulate the bear and also to waterproof it. So the water, when it rains, it doesn't make it all the way to the skin to make them really cold. It kind of gets trapped in the fur on top where it can evaporate, and they remain effectively dry underneath. So it's like they're wearing a raincoat.
Somebody asked about why bears hibernate during winter instead of storing food in their dens. I mean, this is just the way they've evolved, is this is their method of doing it. The most important reason that bears do hibernate is because there isn't any food for them available in the winter. So they can't live off of, browsing shrubs like the ungulates can or something. They can't live off of just eating grass. They need more concentrated food sources. And so this is their way of surviving a period without any food. And so a lot of people ask, oh, do our bears den here? They think that they don't, but bears in British Columbia do, and bears on Vancouver Island do den. The only times they come out of their dens in winter is if there is a food source available. So sometimes there's some bears who live very close to the coast where they can feed on mussels and barnacles and blenny eels and even late salmon runs. We have some salmon runs that show up in January kind of thing. And so you might have some bears who come out to those. Or if you live in a really irresponsible community that has garbage available, they might come out for garbage, but generally it's that there isn't any food, and so that they stay in their dens. And certainly any female who's producing cubs can't leave the den in the winter. So it's just how they've evolved, is to do it this way. If they were to try and store food, they'd need far too much food. They wouldn't have the room to store the kind of food and the concentrated food, unless it was like chunks of lard kind of thing. Or if we had nuts like our squirrels are living off of or something, if they had nuts that are a really concentrated food source that they could somehow store, that might be the only time that they would have been able to do that. But since there isn't that much of that kind of food available, this is just how evolution worked for them in how they developed. Yeah,
it's all about trying to make your living as cheaply as you can, right? And in some cases, it works out one way, like you're able to store nuts or whatever for the winter. And in other times, depending on the environment, hibernation is the best solution. And so animals have evolved to take advantage of the best option available at the time when their ancestors were evolving. And so you get a diversity of solutions. And right now I've added in some of the details on the faces of these animals. So what I'm trying now in the little cub is there's a couple of these little lighter spots on their face. So those are actually, I'm just gonna put an arrow, don't put the arrows in yourself, but those two there, those are little markings kind of thing, they're little lighter spots on their face. So when you're coloring these in, you can color them in afterwards. You can even send them in letters to your government ministers to say, here, let's please make responsible government policy to protect bear dens. And you can illustrate your letters with these pictures, for example, and send them along. We've suggested that on numerous cases because, of course, a wonderful picture from kids is probably going to be harder for them to ignore along with the letter than if it doesn't come out with its ideas anyway. But yeah, they have these wonderful little light spots. I have put those in.
Into talking about when you start drawing the tree around them, Julius, we'll talk a little bit about the entrance sizes and stuff of these dens.
Yes, right. Well, we're just getting to that now. So I'm going to zoom out a little and I'm going to start putting it.
Asking about, do you have any tips on drawing bears in situ proportionally with the trees, stumps, salmon, etc.?
Good question. So if we're talking about potentially plein air drawing where we have the animal in front of us, that one I don't. I've only encountered a bear once in the wild myself, with nothing in between me and the bear, and that was an interesting experience because I felt very exposed, I guess, because I never experienced this before. But it was really neat in hindsight to be able to see this bear just foraging on the ground in Jasper and it hadn't seen me, so I just kind of slinked off. But so I don't know, I've not worked on them that way, but in terms of if you're looking at for bears in their natural environment, well, we're gonna do that actually here right now to show the bear in its den. But in terms of the size of other objects around it, it really depends on their environment. They live in a huge range of environments all over North America. They're endemic to North America, which means they live nowhere else, this species. But they used to live in a lot larger proportion of, for example, the United States than they do today. They've lost close to like, what, 50% or more of their native habitats, of their native sort of home range. And now they're more confined to the north, and we've lost probably 7 different populations of them. Some of them are critically endangered now, because it's important to remember not all of these they're not just one species and that's all. It's complex. Many different populations that have differences between them. And so what you have in the environment around them depends on where you're trying to illustrate this bear. So the in situ illustration, in other words, showing it in its environment, will depend on what kind of environment and what subspecies of bear you're trying to illustrate. So that really is kind of a bit of a complex answer, but I think the key is to remember that this is a complex system too, that we can show so many different aspects about it. And it's interesting because it gives you the opportunity as an artist to show many different versions of the same animal living in different areas. So I'm going to put in sort of the back of the youngster as well. These guys are kind of reclining at the edge of their den opening. And actually, as we start to, I'm just put the paws in here as well of the baby, of the cub. They're big. Paws of black bears are really big. But unlike grizzly bears, they don't have proportionally as long claws. They have long claws. They can't retract them like a cat, but they're not quite as long as that, like the very rake-like claws of grizzly bears. So when we put the claws in, they're kind of short. So right now we're only going to be able to see the claws and the paws of the youngster, because the mun is fully inside of her den. But you can see them all the time on the outside. There's 5 fingers. I'm only showing 4 of them on this paw because this paw we're seeing it a little bit from the side. So we're missing the thumb claw basically from view. But that's okay. That's important to remember, that when we see things in situ, we often see them in angles that they're not textbook type. We can't see everything at once. And so that actually ends up working quite well. So the arms, again, these bears have so much fur that you can sort of see just kind of a rounded outline of some of their features, like their arms or the little folds at their neck, for example. The fur kind of bunches up a bit, but you don't see those really sharp like elbows and so on very easily because they are so furry, and that fur makes them very, very round. That's also important because an animal in the north that experiences cold temperatures, the rounder they become, the lower is the amount of their surface compared to their volume, which is important because that means that the speed at which they can lose heat to their environment in the cold is slowed down. It's one of those neat tricks that animals in the north use. They become plumper and rounder through evolution so that they don't lose heat as quickly. So now we're going to add.
And those 5 toes, well, you talk about the claw length. So black bears do have shorter, more curved claws than grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are quite a lot straighter, and that's because they evolved in the plains, and those claws are straighter for digging. They're meant to dig in the soil with those, which is why they look almost identical to badger claws, because that's what badger claws are for. So they're very much the same, whereas black bears evolved in forested environments, and their claws are more curved because they're meant for climbing trees. So black bears, when they're scared, will climb up trees, and the moms send their cubs up trees all the time for safety, whereas grizzly bears aren't as good climbers. They can use trees that have strong side limbs. They can use those like a ladder more. They still can get up trees, but nowhere near as easily as a black bear, who can just run up and down so quickly. So the black bears do have, like Julia said, 5 toes. Somebody was asking about the similarities between bear and human bodies. So, you know, the 5 digits is the same. Bears have single stomachs like we do, not like multi-chambered stomachs like cows and ungulates have. So we're quite similar in that way. We have less hair generally than they do. Their teeth are more specialized as carnivores to have longer canines, but they do have fairly flat molars for chewing a bit more, not like an ungulate or a deer or something, but they do have sharper teeth for also for grabbing things like salmon and stuff out of the river. So this is great, Julius. We've got some getting the opening of the tree now. And this is a fairly large opening in the tree that Julius is drawing so that we can see the bears. Often the bear and the den entrances are actually incredibly small, and people never believe me. The bears can fit inside these trees that we find, or so if anybody wants to see footage of a female squeezing in and out of a den, I actually created a den in a stump, a cedar stump. We put a lid on it and we cut an entrance, and it's 30 by 35 centimeters. I can't fit in and out of this thing. I have found 2 small friends that I have convinced to go inside to do the things inside this den that I need done, but I can't get in it. And there's some footage on a video on YouTube of the stump den that we made, like how we made it. And this female goes in head first a lot, but she actually goes in bum first more, which I just can't figure out how she does it, because I've seen the video footage of her doing it, and then I go there when she's not home, to be clear. And I try and get it, and I'm like, oh, if I turn my body like this, and I cannot get my shoulders through this thing, and she just goes in and out like it's nothing. And because, like we said about them clawing the bedding towards them, she backs in so that she can kind of grab the bedding that she's piled up outside the entrance, and then she can pull it right inside the den with her and stuff. So it's pretty cool footage to watch her squeezing it out. So this is a den with an entrance in the base, the basal entrance, and so often it's quite a bit smaller to make it warmer, of course, and to have less air flowing in and out, and also safer for them. But this one's much more picturesque than most of them, when you might see absolutely nothing through the entrance.
Yeah, we're kind of cheating a bit here because we need to be able to see the bears, right? Otherwise, we just see maybe a snout and a little bit of the face. But this is an art lesson about the bears as well. So we kind of had to imagine if we were to kind of pull away some of the opening there and make it larger. Or I think, as you told me before, actually, Helen, that the male bears may have larger openings than the females with their cubs.
Yeah, and I don't know if my profile picture shows up anywhere, but it's me in a pink raincoat inside an actual den that has a huge entrance on it. I've never seen one that big, but it was all lined with salal, so I know that it actually had been used. as a den, but it's very large. Whereas, yeah, some of them are just sort of, this size.
Wow.
Which, if you're claustrophobic, this was maybe not the best line of work for me to take up in my life.
Definitely would be challenging. And what I'm putting down here at the bottom, as Helen was describing how they will bring branches and other types of dead material, pulling it in with their paws. This is like a little bit of that bottom there where they've kind of piled it up, and it's actually hiding part of the bottom end of the mother bear, so you can't see her paws. But there's this nice pile of dead vegetation, twigs and branches and stuff that I'm adding the details to down here. So you can actually just add lots and lots of lines of different kinds, try to draw little branches and so on. And then that just goes to show, to distinguish it from the shape of the tree itself, which right here we've made sort of kind of a fluted red cedar tree trunk, the base of it, which sometimes develop these large openings inside as the inner heartwood can rot some of the time and form this enormously tall, hollow interior space that the bears then use for denning. Yeah. And
for those who asked, the video links Maya's posted in the chat. Somebody asked if male bears den alone. Yeah, so the female gives birth to her cubs in the den, and then she nurses them for months before they leave, and then they'll all den together at least the following winter. In some places longer than that, or more winters than that, but at least that. And then after that, they're on their own. And so, yeah, the males will be alone once they've left their mother, and the females only ever denned with their cubs. Yeah.
And you can see this cub in this picture is a little bit bigger than your than the newborns, which are, as you said, about maybe a pound. So they're like a block of butter, and imagine holding a block of butter. That's the size of the weight of a newborn black bear cub. They're tiny, tiny little beauties. Yeah. And so this one's a lot bigger, clearly. And so I'm not actually sure, how old would you say this one looks relative to the mother?
That yearling who's in the one video in the sort of the root wad den that's in some of those videos. So it looks a lot like that one.
Then I got it right, because that was the sort of the intention. But so yeah, that just goes to show this wonderful bond that develops, this longer term relationship between the mother and the cubs. A lot of animals don't have everything from instinct. Some, they learn behaviors and so on from their parents. We see this a lot with whales, for example, orcas. And so it's important sometimes to have these bonds between the young and the adults. Many birds, such as corvids like crows, also have this interesting cultural importance of learning. And having the parents there to take cues from, to learn their behaviors from, can be very important. We know it very much for ourselves because we learn almost everything from our parents, but many animals do, of other species too.
They do. The babies learn, the cubs learn, where the important food sources are. They often will take over, the female cubs take over a portion of their mother's home range. They take over part of it or live very close to their mothers, whereas the males are kicked out to go farther afield and establish new territories on their own. But they'll learn den sites and everything from their mothers. The bears do look for their dens year round. So they are checking, I think, like, it's kind of like, I think they probably have like a little catalog of potential den sites in their heads. And so I've had video footage of them even checking them out the end of April. They've probably left one den and gone to be like, okay, that one's still there, that one's still there. Because of course, these are sometimes being logged by logging companies. They also blow down, or some of them are rotting away, those ones in stumps. And in the one in some of the videos that we've posted that's in a root wad, it's very decayed. It's not going to last a lot longer. So they need to kind of have a list of potential den sites. Sometimes they show up at dens and they're already occupied, so they need somewhere to go. And if they get disturbed in the winter, either by windfall or people or dogs, they need to have another den to go to. So they do sort of have this little catalog of dens and do check them out at other times of the year. They don't generally sleep in them at other times of year or anything, but they will go and just visit them.
It's interesting how complex their lives are. and how much there is to learn about them, and how important it is for us to do what we can to protect them and to learn about them and interest others as much as we can as well. So, Helen, what would you recommend is a really good thing that those of us in the public who are interested in concern for these bears can do to help them the most?
Well, I've been running a campaign to try and get bear dens protected through legislation. Currently, bear dens are only protected in Haida Gwaii and the Great Bear Rainforest. Elsewhere, they can be logged. So I've been trying to pressure the provincial government to protect dens through legislation, through a change to the Wildlife Act, so that they're protected on both Crown land and private forest lands. And so letters to your MLAs right now through the Sierra Club letter writing campaign, letter writing site does seem to have been making an influence. The MLAs have definitely noticed the number of letters that they're getting. So they tell me. But yeah, just educating yourself and letting others know about these kinds of dens. You know, the bears aren't just using these hollow cedars on Vancouver Island. I've been to hollow cedar dens in Revelstoke and Vernon, up at Silver Star, and you know, they use cottonwood trees, especially with above ground entrances all over British Columbia. They're incredibly important along riparian areas and stuff. So have people look for them and try and get them protected. Be great.
And actually, I've heard from members of the Legislative Assembly that they recommend for us to do these kinds of things to put pressure on the government, you know, letter writing, peaceful demonstrations, and so on. They say that those are noticed, that from inside the government, they say that this is something that we should be doing if we want to make a difference, because that really does actually get noticed. Sometimes we feel like, what's the point? You know, it feels too hard, like there's a lot of dismay and so on. But let's not be dismayed, because we've seen in many cases where we've worked together to put this kind of pressure on government, that it has made differences. We've seen public pressure lead to the cancellation of very damaging large projects by industry sometimes that would have otherwise harmed large areas. So there is good reason to continue this, as Helen is saying. So let's roll up our sleeves and do what we can to make this message heard by those people who are making the policies.
Yeah, I've met with a few MLAs and they've been like, yeah, we're getting letters. They definitely take notice of those. We just have a quick question on guidance on adding color and texture to the fur.
Oh, yes, right. Good idea. That's a good point. Thank you for that question. That's a good one. So the color is interesting in black bears. Depending on where they are, they're either jet black, which is something that a lot of us kind of see, or they're ranged to sort of a dark brown. And then there are also cinnamon bears, which are a type of black bear. It's a subspecies that has a very sort of cinnamon colored coat mostly. And then, of course, we talked about the Kermode bears, the spirit bears, which are blonde to white in their coat. So that's really unusual. They look like polar bears in some ways, except for the shape of their bodies and face. And there are also ones that have sort of like a silvery bluish, almost kind of highlights to their fur in some parts. I think is it Alaska where there are some of those ones, maybe?
Northwestern BC.
Northwestern BC. Okay, so we have some of those here. So big range in colors, but the ones we'll see most often around here on the west coast of BC are dark brown to black. Those little spots I put on their face, just in front of and above the eye, are sort of lighter patches. Around their eye, there's a little bit of a rim of lighter skin than the black typically. And then, of course, the tongue is pink. And then in some cases they'll have this sort of crescent-shaped or crescent moon-shaped light spot on their chest, just below their neck. That's not common, but it does occur in some of them as well. And again, if we wanted to see kind of the preview that we had before, this kind of shows you what the orientation of the fur might be like, sort of. It kind of spreads out along the face and then kind of goes backward. Again, remember, these are animals that are walking through thick forests sometimes, because they're a forest species primarily, and their fur tends to line in a direction that makes it easy for them to pass through this bush. So you'll see this kind of almost streamlining of the direction of fur on their faces to make it easier for them to pass through. It's kind of a slip through the vegetation. and along their bodies as well. And so this, I've pictured some of these as sort of darker ones, and they've got a little bit of a lighter area under their muzzle as well. Not too light, but a little bit lighter. So that kind of gives you a rough idea of their coloration. And these drawings you make, you can use them as coloring sheets. The background you can color up with lots of moss-covered trees, because this is a rainforest. And the red cedar, the color of the bark is beautifully sort of russet colored. That's another really wonderful thing. And of course, the vegetation, the dead vegetation at the bottom, the litter is often also colored like that because of the branches of the red cedar, for example, and other things as well. Rotting vegetation often looks that way, especially in these forests. And of course, behind the bears, in the den, you can make that really dark because that's a very enclosed space, and it's black looking in there basically from the outside. That gives you sort of an idea.
One of the things I'll point out on your drawing, which is excellent, is around the entrance to that cavity in the tree, like you can kind of see it. It looks kind of chewed, and so Hanelas goes out and looks for CMTs, which are culturally modified trees. I call these BMTs. They're bear modified trees because
Yeah.
chewing of the entrances to make them large enough to squeeze through often, but they actually also do a lot of clawing and chewing on the inside of the trees as well. It's one of the ways we identify that something actually is a den. So I do have a bear den identification manual. If somebody's like really trying to, they think maybe they found something that a bear is denning in, and what are the things you look for? And we look for bear carpentry as one of the signs of it, that because they'll claw down the inside of the tree probably to use that as bedding and insulation as well, but they'll still chew the inside and around the entrance even when they don't need to make it bigger. I haven't quite totally understood that, but then we look for bear hair around the entrance as well, because when they're squeezing in and out of small spaces, they catch their hair on things, and that bedding, the bedding inside is a clear indicator that it's been used as a den. So we look for all those kinds of things to try and determine if something really has been used as a den. But that was a great addition on your drawing. It's kind of all jagged around the edge there.
Well, thank you. Actually, I used some of the pictures of bear dens, photographs, to kind of inform me of the overall sort of pattern of some of these. And that is something that I noticed on some of the photographs. It's really neat that you bring up the reason for why that happens like that. So that's interesting to learn these things. And so this is something that's useful for people walking through the forest to take note of as well, and to note that we're sharing this forest with these cousins of ours. They're all our extended family. We share the same common ancestor. They're all our family, and they're living beside us as neighbors as well in this forest. And they were there long before we were. And these are the signs.
A question here about wood pellets and clear cutting. They're talking about a company named Drax, but they're referring to companies in BC that are getting away with this. When it comes to clear cutting, it's a lot of Western Forest Products, BCTS, which is BC Timber Sales. What is Sierra Club doing about this? There's only so much that any organization can do when a lot of these companies, they, out of sight, out of mind. So a lot of companies can get away with a lot of bad and or illegal practices if no one's there to monitor it. And when it comes to what is Sierra Club doing about this? Well, one thing is these learn to draws and splitting awareness with the fun of artistry, but as well as there's a lot of advocacy for helping local Indigenous nations regain autonomy over their territories in a industry and area which has been so reliant and pigeonholed on old growth logging. And again, these are small towns which are generations and generations in this sort of old logging culture. And so I believe it's to put the pressure on the government to make sure that there is alternative economic areas to delve into for people in these small towns, in these logging areas, right? So I guess it gets quite political and a little complex, but yeah, that's what I would say the main thing to do to help is, yeah, help to advocate for Indigenous autonomy for the territories, and to advocate for alternate areas for job sectors for people in these communities as well.
That's a really good point, and something that many of us should focus on whenever we are advocating to the government. And that's something we've been pushing for in some of our groups as well, is that it's true that when you look at our history, and studies all around the world with Indigenous people of all backgrounds show that the best protectors of native ecosystems tend to be the Indigenous people who were there in a stable association with these environments for thousands of years. And it is the arrival of exploitative industry that has led to the vast majority of the damage to these environments. So one of the best solutions we can think of is exactly as you're saying. We need to give economic power back to the Indigenous First Nations people who were here, and which industry in many cases is taking advantage of. They're getting, in many cases, a much more unfair economic treatment by these companies than would be fair, than it would be due out of just basic respect and a necessity for stable survival on other forms of making their living than the kinds of industry that is causing damage to these environments. We need to make sure that the government hears that clearly, that we need a lot more, as you said, autonomy for First Nations people, because it is well known and is also, as I said, scientifically supported from studies from social studies of all around the world, that is in fact the best solution anyway. So regardless of who you're asking, it is actually the best solution. So this is something we've been doing, and that everybody needs to be doing a lot more than we have been as well.
Yeah, I did mention that bear dens are protected in Haida Gwaii and the Great Bear Rainforest. The only reason they're protected there is because of pressure from the First Nations and land use orders. That's the only reason. There is, if you think bear dens are important on Haida Gwaii, how can they not be important on Vancouver Island? Like, it's crazy.
Yeah, everything points to that. It just makes so much sense. Yeah, so there you go. That's an important message for everybody to send to government, I think. Well, so that's our drawing. Sorry, go on.
I was just gonna say, I love it. It looks fantastic. I'm very impressed.
Thank you, and well, hopefully everybody had fun with this too. And you can, since this is recorded, you can always go back and make other ones as well. You can use it as a coloring sheet. As we said, you can use it in your letter writing campaigns to help illustrate those. Either send them in physical mail or scan them and send them with emails and so on. Lots of possibilities there. I've done that before with letters, and I'm hoping it makes a difference. But I think with lots of people doing that, it could actually. It shows you care too. Put effort into something, right? So, but there you go. So anyway, that's all I have to say, except that thank you so much for everybody for attending today. I had a lot of fun. I hope everybody else did. Helen, thank you. That was so much wonderful learning that we had today. I really enjoyed that a great deal.
Thanks.
Yes, again, another fun session here with the Julius, and it was wonderful meeting you, Helen. Yeah, it's time to wrap up.
Just reading someone's comment, I think my drawing looks like a wolf licking a cougar's head. That's awesome. That's how mine would look too.
Oh, it takes practice. That's the thing. Well, and also remember there are interactions between different species, so you can also modify that too. You can tell a different story. Not all interactions between carnivores are predation. Sometimes we get interesting types of interactions where it's actually gentle. Life is interesting. The natural world is fascinating. So yeah, maybe it is a bear looking at cougar in that case too. Who knows?
Thanks for everyone's nice comments on there. It was great. I'm glad
Thank
that
you, everyone.
people enjoyed it. It was fun.